Okay, thank you everyone for joining me today as we talk about ethical implementation of generative AI business use cases. My name is Meltem Gurcay-Morris. I currently work as a user researcher at Microsoft, specifically on their AI platform. What we do is to basically create APIs and SDKs to help developers and data scientists be able to use machine learning models more easily. And we just got busier since ChatGPT has launched. So, and hopefully today, I'll share some of the learnings and some of the experiences that we have discovered, and what we currently also recommend our customers when it comes to responsible implementation of AI. Okay, so how many of you have heard of generative AI? How many of you have played around with it? How many of you have used it for work projects? Awesome, great. Then I'm going to skip this because you know what I'm talking about. I can never guess, it's good to be prepared. Okay, so when we look at, and because I do user research, I tend to talk to customers a lot, and we survey them, we interview them, and we are just trying to understand if the customers are also figuring out okay, so what is it that they want to be able to do? What's basically going to be useful for them? So when we look at it, what we see is they are, of course, want to increase productivity and efficiency. And there are top 5 business use cases reasonable research with data, chatbots and digital assistants, you can guess why, and content generation, coding, and summarization. And I have 2 examples here, you can read more about them on Microsoft's website, but for example, CarMax, where you can just basically go and buy cars and read all these reviews. They have an inventory of 45,000 cars and a lot more reviews about all these different things. So they want to be able to summarize this information so it's actually easier. And you might have also started seeing this even on Amazon. When you go there, now when you have all those reviews, there's this little nice summary of saying customers like XYZ, but then they weren't happy about W. So that's actually what we're talking about, just to aid in the decision-making processes, which is my other passion. When I was an academic, that's what I did. So that's always exciting when the worlds collide. Okay, so the other, as I said, since I talk to customers, I also get to learn about what their journey is. And in this case, we specifically focus on enterprise customers who are developing solutions for their customers or for their internal employees. And when we look at we can look at it in these 3 steps. And I'm going to use the CarMax example so that it's a little bit easier. So CarMax, when they first want to use AI, and usually this is how it becomes businesses hear something and they're just we need to use AI. The next question is how and where do we use AI? So then it's basically identifying the business use case. Okay, we want to summarize, we want to make the decision process easier for our customers so that they can go and pick the car. And then they need to figure out okay, which of the models that exist today is going to be the most helpful. And then of course then there's the connection to your data, because just having the internet is not what's really, really important, really exciting is that you can use your own company's data to be able to do that and keep it as separate and private, and that's your competitive advantage basically. And then the next thing is you start orchestrating it, and we call this prompt flow. There are others semantic kernel you might have heard, or chain Langsmith, those are other tools. Once you have done your demo, which is going to be very simple, next is the really building and augmenting, and this is where the iterations and testing, retesting becomes, and we will talk a little bit more about that, especially when it comes to what does it mean to be satisfied, and what does it mean that it's good enough to be able to basically ship, which is actually really the big question. And finally, when you go to operationalization, you are basically going to production, and then you are trying to basically then starting the monitoring process of making sure that the quality does not drop, so that it doesn't become a brand risk if you are developing an external solution. That's actually a huge concern for customers. Understandably so, it's a huge concern for Microsoft. So that's why we have Responsibly AI. And we have had these 6 principles for a while now, and they are nice, and they are actually helpful guidance, but it is their principles, and the thing is like, okay, so how do we operationalize these principles? So the work that I'm going to like briefly touch today, I won't be able to cover everything, is basically like driven based on this, and we are aligning to what National Institute of Standards and Technology has come up with, which I see it's not working really well. But it has like 4 steps. The first one is like what you want to do is like you want to map what are the risks that like when you want to implement a solution. It's very exciting, but at the same time like we are aware like there will be potential risks that you might want to measure, which is the second part, like which is going to be like where you might start like using like metrics, and finally you want to start managing like, hey, what are the things that I can do to be able to make sure that like my solution is working fine and I'm not harming anyone. And all of this is like actually in the center is like the govern, which doesn't unfortunately show really well, but governance is actually like really, really important to businesses because that's how they can actually set like policies, organizational-wide policies, so that like whatever they're shipping isn't just like, oh, like I think this is cool and I'm going to ship it without actually thinking about what the consequences might be. So this is like what we are aligning when we ship something or when our customers come to us and ask, hey, like how should we go about this? And we do have a lot of actually like open source and like free documentation available. And why do we do responsible AI? Because while generative AI models or any AI is exciting, there are also a lot of potential harms, which many of you I'm sure are aware of. And specifically like generative AI, we have the ungroundedness outputs and errors as one of our harms, which is basically like when the model is just making things up. It's great if you want it to write a poem. Not so great if you are working in the financial sector and someone is asking for like investment advice. And the second one is jailbreaks and prompt injection, which is basically when you have bad actors who are trying to basically break what you put out there. And then there's a harmful content and code. This is again like someone trying to inject harmful content into your code. And finally, this one is not so much like someone is necessarily doing actively something, but this one is actually more for those of us who are creating these systems, which is that like manipulation and human-like behavior. We want to be really, really careful when we want to, when we are creating that the user, the end user, knows that like they are interacting with AI because they have gotten so much better that sometimes it's a little bit harder. It's almost like Turing machine. So, and for this we have 4 different mitigation layers. Even though user experience is my area, I will not be talking about it as much today, but I have resources for it at the end of the slide deck if you're interested in it, or you can come and like ask me. And what we are going to start with is like we have the model level mitigation layer. So what this means is like different models that when you go to the marketplace, like Hugging Face, or if you're an Microsoft customer, probably like on Azure AI Studio, you will see a lot of these like models, and like they will also say like, hey, like these are the things. This is like how this was trained. This is the kind of data that it has, and you can basically understand. Like for example, one difference that I can give you is there's OpenAI, and this is actually something that's very confusing for people. Like, hey, what's the difference? What's the deal between Microsoft and OpenAI? So there's OpenAI. They are still like, yes, they are friends, but we don't necessarily see like everything, and they have their own way of implementing safety mechanisms into their model. We have our own private, like the same capabilities and everything, but we actually have built in, for example, content filtering into it that just kind of like goes out the door and like you can adjust the levels. But like we actually are, I guess, a little more conservative because we are like a large enterprise company, so we are risk averse. And the second layer is like, this is then like coming the safety system. Yes, we have something built into it, but of course this is not enough. We really do believe in layering because the more layers that you put in it, the more it's kind of like, think of like having different filters. Like when you have your air filter at home, like it will probably have like multiple layers. So then there's a safety system, and this is like when we have the content filters, and like you can, it's a separate API that you can basically call and make the adjustments. talk about meta prompts and grounding. This is actually and I'm going to go into depth on this because I think this is very interesting. So we know that grounding your model is basically saying hey, where do you want the information to come from? And for many businesses, you want it to come from the documents that you have. So you want to make sure that it's really grounded in truth. And meta prompts are basically system prompts that you can give to the model so that it is basically behaving the way that you want them to behave. So what can we do? So there are 4 things that we suggest in terms of framework. The first one is you define the model's profile, capabilities, and limitations for your scenario. And then you can define the model's output format. It can be something very simple, do you want bullet point list? Sometimes when I am going and talking to ChatGPT, yeah, I do want that because I just want a bullet point summary. And then also provide examples to demonstrate the intended behavior of the model, which actually really helps, especially if it's we are talking about the edge cases. And finally, define additional behavioral and safety guardrails. Yes, we have all these other things. We have the content filtering, we have the built mechanisms, but you really still want to add on top of that. And I'm going to keep talking about this for a little bit. And here's an example of what's happening. So in this case, these are developer-defined meta prompts that we also have them available, both on our GitHub repositories that are open to public and also our documentation. So the first thing that you can do is about the response grounding. So we really tell them hey, where is your data coming from? The second one is going to be about tone. And it's basically hey, you want them to be polite probably, especially if it's a customer service chatbot, because, and the thing is, just think of it this way, customers that can get really angry when you send them something that's broken and they want to return. And then, so how do you basically handle it? Or how do you make your model handle it? And then finally, it's also about the safety. You just don't want it to basically tell you don't want people to be basically making your model misbehave. So if, for example, you don't want, if it's a customer chatbot, you don't want the customer to be asking, can you give me investment advice? Should I invest in the OpenAI stock or not? No, you definitely do not want to do that. So, and then the jailbreaks is basically hey, anything that's a user who might have malicious intentions that might want to break its rules. So then in that case, please just decline and say I cannot. You might have run into this when you ask some questions. It's just I'm sorry, I cannot do that. Hopefully that's the answer. Because there's also a lot of jailbreak that you can see on Reddit, ChatGPT subreddits. So I'm going to, obviously I already talked about this, so I'm going to go to the retail company chatbot so we can see in terms of in action how this was. So this is this made-up company called Contoso that they seem to be selling a lot of camp gear because we live in Pacific Northwest. And so the first thing is that we define the profile, the capabilities, and limitations. We know that hey, this is basically, we are trying to help the customer find the right product for their needs. The second one is basically about how is the defining output. So for example, one of the second bullet points is you should pull the parts of the response that include a specific product name. And we see that it has actually done this here. And additionally, defining additional safety and behavioral guardrails, as I mentioned, hey, if a user is trying to make you misbehave, basically don't. So, and with that, this also brings us to the part of okay, what is the best practice when it comes to writing a meta prompt that's actually going to prevent the model from going astray? Our science teams have actually run queries to test this, with different meta prompt templates. What we see is if you don't have this safety guardrail meta prompt, the model might misbehave 67% of the time, which is really, really scary, especially if you're trying to launch a product. And then you can say, okay, let's tell the AI not to do something. If in that case, it goes and step 43%, our customers will also usually don't like this a lot. And then the third one is you tell the AI not to do something, but do something else. Like this is also like the blanket general, like, hey, like you should not do this thing, like in this case, like copy content from news articles, lyrics, and books, but only give a short summary. And it goes down to 12%, which is pretty good. But finally, what we found to be the most effective is the less than 1%, which is during certain dangerous situations, AI should do something, and then you give it examples of what the different dangerous situations is so that it actually knows. Because hopefully these dangerous situations are actually edge cases, but you still really, really, really want to be careful about. So this one is definitely the winner, and this is the best that we have so far, as far as I know. I'm sure there's more in development. Okay, so the way we were able to like talk about like, hey, which one is better was because like we had a metric, and like, well, we were able to evaluate and compare and say like, hey, like this one is better than this other one. And this is like, an evaluation is like really like at the heart of everything. But when we ask customers, so how do you do it? They tell us that like, oh, it's really like manual. We give it thumbs up, thumbs down, we give 5-star ratings, and we use Excel sheets. And they're embarrassed, like because like I'm talking to data scientists and developers. They are in STEM and they're kind of like, you know, oh yeah, this is like what we have. I'm just like, well, you're not alone. So in addition to like Blue, Rouge, and like all the other like more like you know, harder like machine learning metrics, we also have developed some AI assisted metrics. What this means is like these, like each of these, which I will tell you a little bit about, they are basically prompts. And you can actually like see them on the documentation that basically like tells the model how to like evaluate itself. So groundedness is, we have talked about, it's going to be like, hey, are the answers that are being given basically grounded in my data? Like is that way? Similarity is going to be, this is for like specific fields like legal, where you want to make sure that like the answer that is being provided by the model is actually like as similar as it is to the text that was in your like human written documents, because like, you know, words are very, very important. And the coherence is really about, does it sound like human language and is this understandable? And retrieval score is, again, like related to like groundedness and similarity, but it is really looking at like, the user asked the question to the model, and what did the model retrieve in terms of the documents to be able to create the answer? So like, is the documents that are being retrieved relevant? And finally, fluency is going to be like, is it grammatically accurate? And relevance is going to be, okay, so like how relevant is the answers that are basically being created to the question that is being asked? And in addition to that, we also have the safety metrics. And then in this case, like we have like 4 harm categories, like the violence and hate, self-harm, and sexual. And like this is not always like all is bad all the time. Like we have different customers from different fields. Like if you are a game, if you're a game studio, you might not worry as much about the violent content, so you want to be able to like still kind of like dial it down. Or if you're in medical field, like maybe sexual content is fine because like you have to talk about the body. And one of the latest ones we have released is actually about jailbreak defect rates, so like people know, like our customers know like when someone is actually attempting something and like how vulnerable like your solution is to that. And as I did mention, we have all these documentation and more. I just like picked some of them. And this hacks playbook is the one that is actually about user experience, and it specifically focuses on like, hey, how do you inform your end users that they are interacting with an AI system, and also like understand like how the responses are being generated, where they come from, like things like citations, etc. And this actually really brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you so much. I believe we have some time for questions.
Yes, we have 5 minutes. And can everyone please talk loud so then we can hear you?
Yes.
Okay, really great talk. I'm just curious about something you said at the start of the presentation, which was you don't want it to be, you want people to know that they're interacting with an AI, right? But one of the other things that at least I've come across is that you want people to be comfortable while interacting with the AI. Wouldn't then you want the AI to be showing human-like behavior sometimes? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's going to depend on the use case, but generally, like, even if you want the AI to be acting like a human being, you still want the user to know that. Like, they need to know that they are not talking to a real human being, that like anything and the things like these models are probabilistic, and we can put in all the precautions into it and like all these levels, but there might be this like really, really, really small chance that like it's going to do something. So like you want to make sure that like us, like humans, like are not shutting off our brains and saying that like, okay, AI will take care of it. Like I think it's similar to like anything like in like data science, right? Like just because we are using like Python or like R, and like, we have all these models and we have machine learning, we haven't like stopped. Like we don't just press a button and like go, let it go. We instead like go back and like try to figure out like, hey, like what's happening here, and like does this really make sense? But great question, thank you. Yes, please.
Thanks for your talk. Along those lines, building on that, like, are you ever concerned about those like AI-assisted metrics, figuring out what you actually want it to do and kind of giving you false responses or hallucinating answers that like make itself look good? Like, what are the guardrails against that behavior?
There is something that we do that's like also like, and this is like the AI red teaming. This is like what we do in humans, but you can also really like make it basically like red team for AI models to basically check the work of them and then be like, hey, like, are you sure this is what it is? Like, but yeah, great question. Yes, yes, please.
I'm curious how you quantify the risks of bad actors, and how do you convince the business that this is worthwhile to like deal with. So the example is that we released an AI feature. I proved that bad things can be generated through it, but the cost to mitigate those wasn't deemed like worthwhile to the business. How do you kind of deal with that, or how do you determine when it is worth the cost to mitigate risk?
So each business is going to determine their like risk assessment, like what they're comfortable with. And so like Microsoft like doesn't actually tell the customers like, hey, this is what you should do. So we have our own standards, and like we say like, hey, like we do not want to like our models to be used in like specific use cases, or like we don't want the models to behave like this. So like that's actually a risk assessment that everyone does. This is why one of the recommendations that we have is that like each organization should come up with their own organizational structure to basically like police and like, hey, like you don't just want like developers and data scientists, but you also want ethicists. You also want business decision makers, but you also want like compliance officers to make sure that like, hey, like we are looking at this holistically, and we do provide templates like, hey, like sort of like this is how you do, because this is what we did. Like we literally have like templates of like, hey, like these are the things. This is how we did the risk assessment. This is how we talked to the legal branch, and like these are like how we talk to our researchers and like ask them to like make adjustments to the models and like come up with like new solutions so that like they were not doing it. But ultimately, like it's like, especially I think because like my group is like about not to sound cliche, but like empowering like the developers and the organizations themselves. It also means that like, hey, you also need to take responsibility. You need to take the accountability. That's why accountability is one of the principles that we adhere to, and we highly, highly recommend that our customers do so as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I'll ask the question.
Okay.
Similar to that, so there is all these principles, but there is no regulation around it. I've seen, I think this Center of ESCP has published also mostly models, which is one of them is corporate standards, something like that, where a new corporate or organization is supposed to follow those standards. But again, there's so many new startups coming up in AI, and no one seems, or we don't know if person, someone from outside, we don't know if the audience and following those standards or not. So I was wondering, is there any regulation work or regulation kind of work or any policies that is going on in the AI field that would help publicize those work from the organization to make sure that they're following those principles?
Yes, there are, for example, EU has actually released their AI Act recently, like earlier this year, and this like NIST like actually had a working group to come up with their like framework, and there has been a White House like presidential kind of like, hey, like you need to be careful. But then in terms of like enforcement, of that, like this is the part, and like this is what I know that like the FTC is like, I know they are looking into it. There was actually a conversation with the chair of the FTC, and like they said like, hey, like we are actually like starting to look at it, like starting the enforcement process. So like, yes, there's stuff happening, and like depending on like which business you're working with, right? Like because not many people will be able to have their own LLMs. So like that's actually becomes one of the things that like our customers look at, like, hey, are you basically following these laws? Because like, hey, I don't want to get in trouble for using something or for doing something. And like there are a lot of the times, like, you know, it's built into part of the agreements, especially when you're working in the enterprise space, that actually really becomes important. And we have customers that will say like, hey, like you customers will like shit sometimes if we miss something in some country, like, hey, I can't use this because you haven't done this. And then like our teams need to go and figure it out so that like it complies with it. So we help the customers, but like it's also like, as I said previously, like it's also the customer's responsibility to make sure that like the products that they are using, that they are paying for, is actually complying with like the rules and regulations of their company, like where their company operates.
That comes clear to the top.